Comrades, you have been told that your survival is a privilege. You have been taught to thank the hand that withholds your bread. You have been persuaded that obedience is virtue and that dependence is security. But I ask you, what kind of society demands gratitude from those it keeps on the edge of hunger? What kind of order convinces the worker that the chains around his wrists are ornaments of protection? This is the great deception of our age. The system does not merely exploit your labor, it manufactures your loyalty to that exploitation. In every factory, in every office, in every field where human sweat is converted into profit, there exists an invisible architecture of power. This architecture was not built by accident. It was constructed carefully, scientifically, with the precision of those who understand that domination is most effective when it disguises itself as necessity. The worker depends on wages to live. But who controls the wages? The capitalist. The worker depends on employment to survive. But who controls employment? The owners of production. The worker depends on the market for food, housing, medicine. But who controls the market? Those who own capital. Thus, dependence is engineered, and once dependence is secured, loyalty can be extracted. The system ensures that the means of life are privately owned. It strips the worker of independent access to land, tools, and resources. It severs him from the instruments of production and then sells back to him the right to survive, hour by hour, day by day. And in this forced exchange, the worker begins to believe that the one who purchases his labor is his benefactor. This is not merely economic domination. It is psychological conquest. The capitalist class understands a truth: a starving man may revolt, but a man kept barely alive will cling to his master. If wages are too low, unrest grows. If they are too high, that profit declines. The system balances misery with dependency. Enough hardship to maintain discipline, enough relief to prevent rebellion. Consider how praise is distributed in such a society. The wealthy are celebrated as job creators. The worker is told he must be grateful for employment. Yet who creates value? Who transforms raw material into wealth? Who builds the railways, manufactures the machines, grows the food, constructs the cities? It is labor. It has always been labor, and yet labor bows before capital. Why? Because the worker has been separated from collective power. Because he stands alone in the marketplace, forced to compete against his fellow workers for survival. The system fractures solidarity and replaces it with rivalry. It whispers, protect your job, fear your neighbor, compete for scraps. And in this competition, the working class polices itself. Dependence becomes loyalty not through love, but through fear. Fear of unemployment, fear of poverty, fear of social exclusion. The system weaponizes insecurity. It binds healthcare to employment. It ties housing to wages. It attaches dignity to consumption. Every necessity becomes conditional, and so the worker internalizes the logic of his oppressor. If I work harder, if I obey, if I remain loyal, I will be safe. But safety under exploitation is an illusion. For what is the condition of the modern worker? He produces abundance yet experiences scarcity. He builds wealth he will never own. He sustains industries that would collapse without him, yet he trembles before the possibility of dismissal. This contradiction lies at the heart of capitalism, social production, private appropriation. The fruits of collective labor are seized by a minority. The many depend on the few for access to what they themselves have created. This is the cruel genius of the system. It does not simply dominate through force. It cultivates ideology. It teaches that inequality is natural. It proclaims that competition is human nature. It declares that markets are neutral and that profit is moral. And when these ideas are repeated enough, the oppressed begin to defend the very structures that confine them. The worker begins to say, "Without the capitalist, I would have nothing. Without the worker, the capitalist would have nothing. Who truly depends on whom? The factories cannot run themselves. The machines do not operate without hands. Capital is not a living force, it is accumulated labor. It is the stored product of workers past and present. Yet the worker is told that capital is powerful, that it must be protected, that its interests are the interests of society. This is false consciousness, the mist that obscures reality. Dependence becomes loyalty because alternatives are concealed. The worker is told that there is no other system, that no other arrangement, no other possibility. He is warned that collective ownership means chaos, that solidarity means inefficiency, that equality means mediocrity. The imagination of the masses is confined within the narrow boundaries of profit. But history teaches us otherwise. Every social order has been presented as eternal until it collapsed. Feudal lords once claimed divine right. Monarchies proclaimed themselves ordained by heaven. And yet they fell when the material conditions changed and the oppressed recognized their collective strength. Capitalism is no different. The system that turns dependence into loyalty relies on fragmentation. It thrives when workers see themselves not as a class, but as isolated individuals. It flourishes when struggle is individualized, when poverty is treated as personal failure rather than structural design. The solution is not individual advancement within the system. It is collective transformation of the system. Workers must recognize that their dependence is artificial. It is constructed by private ownership of the means of production. When these means are held collectively, when factories, land, infrastructure, and resources belong to those who operate them, the foundation of enforced loyalty collapses. For how can one be loyal to a master when there is no master? How can one fear unemployment when society guarantees participation and dignity? The emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. No savior will descend from above. No reform gifted by benevolent elites will dissolve exploitation. The structures that generate dependence must be dismantled by organized, conscious, united labor. Unions must not merely negotiate wages, they must cultivate class awareness. Communities must not merely survive, they must organize. Workers across industries, across nations, across divisions of race, religion, and gender must recognize their shared position in the structure of production. The system wants you divided. It wants you dependent. It wants you loyal. That we must be united, independent, and revolutionary. Let us strip away the illusion that exploitation is generosity. Let us reject the myth that survival under domination is freedom. Let us expose the mechanism by which the system conditions gratitude for crumbs while hoarding the bread. Dependence is not destiny. It is design. And what has been designed can be dismantled. When workers stand together, the balance of power shifts. When labor withdraws its cooperation, production halts. When the oppressed refuse loyalty to their oppressors, the legitimacy of the system fractures. The ruling class fears not poverty, but solidarity. It fears not individual dissent, but organized masses conscious of their strength. Therefore, comrades, awaken. Study the structure. Understand the relations of production. See clearly the chains that bind you, not as natural laws, but as historical constructs. And once you see them for what they are, you will no longer defend them. The system survives because you believe you need it. The truth, it needs you. You are the producers of all wealth. You are the foundation of all industry. You are the engine of society itself. Withdraw your loyalty, and the machinery of exploitation grinds to a halt. Rise not as isolated workers, but as a class. Organize not for charity, but for power. Demand not minor concessions, but transformation. Let us build a society where dependence is replaced by solidarity, where loyalty is given not to profit, but to humanity, where the wealth created by all is shared by all. The chains that bind you are maintained by habit and fear. Break them with consciousness and unity. Comrades, history is not written by those who endure quietly. It is written by those who organize and act. The time has come to end the loyalty of the oppressed to their oppressors. The time has come to reclaim the world that labor built. The system does not rely on brute force alone. It refines control into something quieter, more intimate, more enduring. It engineers dependence with deliberate precision, and from that dependence it extracts loyalty. This loyalty is not born of love or respect, but of necessity shaped into obedience. The modern worker is not chained to the factory by iron restraints, but by economic conditions so carefully constructed that survival itself appears to depend upon submission. When access to food, shelter, healthcare, and dignity is tied to wages, and wages are controlled by those who own the means of production, dependence becomes the foundation of social order. The worker enters the labor market not as a free participant, but as one dispossessed of alternatives, stripped of land, tools, and independent means of subsistence. That the individual must sell labor power in order to live. This separation from the instruments of production is not incidental, that it is the historical outcome of a system that concentrates ownership in the hands of a few. Once dispossession is complete, the laborer stands before capital with no choice but to accept its terms. What masquerades as a voluntary contract is, in truth, an arrangement dictated by material necessity. The system ensures that survival flows through channels it controls. Employment becomes the gatekeeper to healthcare, housing, education, and social standing. That the worker is taught that stability comes from loyalty to the employer, that security arises from obedience, that gratitude is owed for the opportunity to labor. In this way, that the conditions that compel submission are reinterpreted as benevolence. The employer is portrayed no as one who profits from exploitation, but as one who generously provides opportunity. The worker internalizes this narrative, mistaking structural coercion for personal fortune. Dependence is reinforced by calculated insecurity. Wages are calibrated to sustain life, but rarely to grant independence. Debt becomes normalized, binding individuals to continuous employment. Credit systems, mortgages, and consumer culture encourage long-term financial obligations that make the loss of a job catastrophic. That the threat of unemployment hangs perpetually over the workforce, disciplining behavior more effectively than overt punishment. When livelihood is precarious, dissent feels dangerous. Fear cultivates caution, and caution gradually transforms into loyalty. Competition among workers deepens this engineered dependence. Instead of recognizing their shared position within the structure of exploitation, individuals are encouraged to view one another as rivals. Promotions, bonuses, and limited opportunities create a hierarchy within the working class itself. That energy that might have been directed toward collective organization is redirected into individual advancement. In striving to outcompete one another, workers reinforce the system that confines them. Loyalty to the employer becomes a strategy for survival in a competitive environment designed to prevent solidarity. Ideology completes the mechanism. The system promotes the belief that success is solely the result of personal effort and failure the consequence of individual shortcomings. Structural barriers disappear behind narratives of meritocracy. If a worker struggles, the explanation offered is insufficient ambition or discipline, that, not unequal ownership or systemic imbalance. This moral framing transforms economic dependence into a personal test of character. Loyalty becomes proof of responsibility. Criticism becomes evidence of ingratitude. Public discourse reinforces these illusions. Corporations are celebrated as engines of progress, and their leaders are depicted as visionary architects of prosperity. The wealth they accumulate is presented as a reflection of innovation and courage, while the collective labor that generates that wealth remains invisible. Workers are praised for dedication, but rarely acknowledged as the true source of value. The narrative shifts attention from exploitation to aspiration, aiding individuals to identify with the interests of those who dominate them. Even social institutions participate in this conditioning. The educational systems prepare individuals for integration into the labor market, emphasizing adaptability and compliance. Media narratives glorify upward mobility within the system while marginalizing critiques of its foundations. Political rhetoric centers on job creation rather than ownership redistribution, reinforcing the idea that dependence on employers is natural and permanent. In this environment, loyalty appears rational, even virtuous. The most effective domination is that which convinces the dominated to defend it. When workers argue that their employers' profits are essential for societal stability, when they resist policies that would strengthen collective bargaining, when they equate corporate success with national pride, the system has achieved its aim. Dependence has matured into identification. The worker no longer sees capital as an external force extracting surplus value, but as an indispensable partner in personal survival. Yet beneath this manufactured loyalty lies a contradiction. The system depends on labor for its existence. Without workers, factories fall silent, offices empty, and supply chains collapse. Capital accumulates only through the application of human effort. The very class rendered dependent is the class upon which the entire structure rests. This imbalance reveals the fragility concealed within apparent stability. The engineering of dependence is not an accident of modern society, it is its organizing principle. By monopolizing access to the means of life, by sustaining controlled insecurity, by fostering competition, and by embedding ideological justifications into cultural institutions, the system transforms necessity into allegiance. Loyalty is cultivated not through genuine reciprocity, but through constrained choice, where alternatives are obscured and collective power fragmented. Dependence becomes habitual, normalized, and eventually defended by those it confines. Private ownership of production is presented as a natural and efficient arrangement, as though it were the inevitable outcome of human progress. Yet beneath this appearance lies a deliberate structure that manufactures scarcity and consolidates control. When the means by which society produces its goods, factories, land, machinery, technology, infrastructure, are concentrated in the hands of a small minority, access to the necessities of life becomes conditional. What should be abundant through collective labor is rationed through private authority. Scarcity is no longer merely the result of limited resources. It becomes a tool of governance. Human labor has achieved extraordinary productive capacity. Fields yield more food than ever before. The factories generate immense quantities of goods, and technological innovation multiplies output at unprecedented rates. The capacity to meet universal needs exists. Yet hunger persists, homelessness spreads, and essential services remain inaccessible to millions. that this contradiction does not arise from insufficient production but from restricted distribution. Goods are not withheld because they do not exist, that they are withheld because their circulation is controlled by owners seeking profit. Under private ownership, production is not guided by human need, but by market profitability. If food cannot be sold at a profitable price, it is discarded. If housing cannot generate sufficient return on investment, it remains vacant while families sleep without shelter. That e-system tolerates waste alongside deprivation because its logic is not fulfillment of need, but accumulation of capital. Scarcity is therefore engineered through selective access, maintained to preserve price levels and profit margins. Control emerges naturally from this arrangement. When survival depends on commodities produced under private authority, those who own production hold power over those who do not. Employment becomes the mechanism through which individuals gain access to goods. To secure food, one must secure wages. To secure wages, one must submit to the terms set by employers. Ownership thus translates into command. That the economic relationship between employer and worker is not an equal exchange, but a hierarchy structured by possession of productive assets. Artificial scarcity strengthens this hierarchy. By limiting supply relative to demand, owners maintain bargaining power. Labor markets operate on the principle that there are always more workers seeking employment than positions available. This imbalance ensures competition among workers, and driving wages downward and compliance upward. The fear of exclusion disciplines behavior. When losing a job means losing access to healthcare, housing, and stability, obedience becomes rational. Scarcity of opportunity reinforces dependence. The illusion of freedom obscures this caution. Workers appear free to choose their employer, yet all choices occur within a system where the means of production are privately controlled. That freedom to sell one's labor is not freedom from necessity. The worker may choose among masters, but cannot choose independence from the wage relation itself. Private ownership confines autonomy to the boundaries defined by capital. The concentration of ownership intensifies inequality. That profits generated collectively are appropriated privately, accumulating in the hands of shareholders and executives. That this concentration allows owners to expand their influence over markets, politics, and public discourse. Economic power becomes political power. Policies are shaped to protect property rights, suppress labor organizing, and maintain favorable investment conditions. The state, far from neutral, that often functions to preserve the structure of ownership that underpins its authority. Artificial scarcity also penetrates the cultural sphere. Education is commodified, transforming knowledge into a product accessible primarily to those who can afford it. Healthcare becomes a service purchased rather than a right guaranteed. Even time itself is monetized, that measured in billable hours and productivity metrics. Human life is reorganized around access to privately controlled resources. That scarcity ceases to be a natural constraint and becomes a manufactured condition embedded in everyday existence. The system justifies this arrangement by invoking efficiency and innovation. It claims that private ownership incentivizes productivity and rewards risk-taking. Yet innovation itself is frequently the product of collective effort. Public research, collaborative labor, shared knowledge accumulated across generations. The narrative of the lone entrepreneur obscures the social foundations of progress. Ownership appropriates credit for achievements made possible by society as a whole. Control is reinforced by the ideology of property rights. Ownership is framed as sacred, inviolable, the cornerstone of liberty. To question private control over production is portrayed as an attack on freedom itself. Yet the freedom protected is the freedom of a minority to determine how resources are used and who may access them. The majority's freedom is constrained by the necessity of participation in a system where survival depends on selling labor to owners. Artificial scarcity ensures that abundance does not liberate but binds. Even as technology reduces the need for human labor, workers face unemployment rather than leisure. That productivity gains translate into higher profits rather than shorter working hours. The possibility of shared prosperity is subordinated to the imperative of capital accumulation. What could reduce toil instead intensifies insecurity. Private ownership transforms common resources into commodities, enclosing what was once shared. Land that could sustain communities becomes real estate. Water becomes a utility sold for profit. Information becomes intellectual property, guarded by legal barriers. That each enclosure narrows the sphere of collective autonomy and expands the domain of market exchange. Scarcity spreads not because resources vanish, but because access is restricted by design. Through this structure, society produces enough for all yet distributes according to ownership. The paradox of modern capitalism lies in its capacity to generate abundance while perpetuating deprivation. Scarcity is no longer a natural limitation, but a social instrument. Control over production grants control over life's conditions, shaping not only economic outcomes but social relationships, cultural norms, and political possibilities. The architecture of private ownership sustains inequality by converting collective productivity into private command, maintaining a system where the many depend on the decisions of the few. Fear and insecurity are not accidental byproducts of the economic order. They are instruments carefully woven into its fabric. The system does not merely tolerate anxiety among workers. It cultivates it, regulates it, and deploys it as a means of discipline. Where fear prevails, resistance weakens. Where insecurity dominates, obedience appears rational. The modern economy thrives not only on labor, but on the quiet dread that losing one's place within it could mean ruin. Employment under capitalism is structured as both opportunity and threat. It promises income and stability, yet constantly reminds the worker that these can be withdrawn. The contract between employer and employee is never equal. One side holds the authority to terminate, restructure, or replace. This imbalance creates a persistent vulnerability. Even the most diligent worker knows that effort does not guarantee permanence. Markets fluctuate, companies reorganize, technologies replace roles. The uncertainty is normalized, presented as an unavoidable feature of progress, yet it functions as a mechanism of control. When livelihood depends on wages, and wages depend on continued employment, the possibility of dismissal becomes a powerful deterrent against dissent. Workers hesitate to question unsafe conditions, unpaid overtime, or exploitative practices because the risk of unemployment looms larger than the injustice itself. Fear narrows the horizon of action. It persuades individuals to endure what they would otherwise reject. Obedience is not extracted through overt coercion, but through the anticipation of loss. Insecurity extends beyond the workplace into every domain of life. Housing is tied to income. Without wages, rent cannot be paid. Healthcare is often contingent upon employment. Without a job, illness becomes catastrophic. Education, retirement security, even social status are bound to economic participation. This interconnected structure amplifies the consequences of job loss, transforming it from a temporary setback into a threat to survival. The worker understands that stepping out of line may not only cost a paycheck but unravel an entire existence. Debt magnifies this vulnerability. That credit systems encourage individuals to finance homes, vehicles, education, and everyday consumption through long-term obligations. While debt can offer temporary access to goods, it also binds the borrower to continuous income. Missing payments invites penalties, repossession, or financial ruin. Thus, debt reinforces obedience by raising the stakes of unemployment. The more obligations one carries, the less freedom one has to challenge authority. Competition among workers intensifies insecurity. Scarcity of desirable positions ensures that individuals view one another as rivals rather than allies. Performance metrics, ranking systems, and temporary contracts create a hierarchy in which advancement for one may mean displacement for another. This internal competition fragments solidarity. Instead of organizing collectively to demand better conditions, workers strive to outshine their peers, hoping to secure a marginally safer pose. That issue within an unstable system. The ideology of meritocracy deepens this dynamic. Success is attributed to talent and effort. Failure is blamed on personal shortcomings. Structural inequalities disappear beneath narratives of individual responsibility. If a worker struggles, it is said to reflect inadequate skills or insufficient ambition. This moral framing internalizes insecurity. Instead of recognizing economic vulnerability as systemic, individuals interpret it as personal inadequacy. Fear becomes self-policing, that, as workers push themselves harder to avoid the stigma of failure. Technological change is often introduced without safeguards for those displaced. Automation and digitalization promise efficiency and innovation, yet they frequently render workers redundant. Rather than reducing working hours collectively, that productivity gains result in layoffs and intensified workloads for those who remain. The constant possibility of replacement by machines or by other workers maintains a climate of anxiety. Adaptability becomes a survival requirement and those unable to keep pace are left behind. Media narratives and political rhetoric further normalize insecurity. Economic downturn ends are described as cycles beyond human control, and austerity measures are presented as necessary sacrifices. Workers are encouraged to accept wage freezes, benefit cuts, or longer hours for the sake of competitiveness. The language of inevitability discourages resistance. When hardship is framed as unavoidable, endurance appears more practical than opposition. This pervasive insecurity reshapes behavior. Workers avoid organizing for fear of retaliation. They accept precarious contracts rather than demand stability. They silence grievances to protect references and future opportunities. The psychological burden of uncertainty consumes energy that might otherwise fuel collective action. Fear isolates individuals, convincing them that their struggles are unique rather than shared. Economic obedience does not require visible chains. It relies on the visible weight of potential loss. The system ensures that stepping outside prescribed roles carries consequences severe enough to deter defiance. In this environment, loyalty is not necessarily heartfelt. It is strategic. Workers align with their employers' interests not because they believe in them, but because deviation feels danger. The paradox is that those who live under constant insecurity are the very foundation of economic production. Their labor generates the wealth that sustains corporations and markets. Yet the structure denies them stability, ensuring that anxiety remains a permanent companion. Fear becomes a quiet overseer, guiding choices, limiting speech, shaping aspirations. Through insecurity, the system transforms economic necessity into disciplined compliance. Sustaining itself not merely through profit, but through the cultivated apprehension of those upon whom it depends. false consciousness is the most subtle triumph of a system built on exploitation. It does not silence the worker through force, it persuades the worker to misinterpret reality. It reshapes perception so that domination appears as opportunity, inequality appears as fairness, and submission appears as ambition. When exploitation is disguised as advancement, resistance dissolves before it can take form. Under capitalism, the worker is told that the marketplace is a field of equal competitors, that anyone may rise through talent and effort. The wage relation is framed as a voluntary exchange between free individuals. Yet, this apparent equality conceals a deeper imbalance. One class owns the means of production, the other owns only its labor power. The contract between them is shaped not by mutual independence, but by necessity. The worker must sell labor to survive, while the capitalist may choose among many workers. This asymmetry is obscured by the language of freedom and choice. Opportunity becomes the central myth. The system celebrates stories of exceptional ascent, individuals who rise from poverty to wealth through determination. These narratives are elevated as proof that the structure is just. The rare success is broadcast as universal possibility, while the structural barriers faced by the majority remain invisible. The worker is encouraged to identify not with fellow laborers, but with the capitalist he hopes to become. Aspiration replaces solidarity. In this way, exploitation is reframed as a stepping stone. Long hours, low wages, and precarious conditions are presented as temporary sacrifices on the path to advancement. The worker endures hardship not as an imposed burden, but as an investment in a future imagined within the same system. Even when upward mobility proves elusive, the belief in its possibility sustains compliance. Hope becomes a mechanism of stabilization. The ideology of meritocracy deepens false consciousness. Success is attributed to personal virtue, discipline, intelligence, resilience, while failure is blamed on individual weakness. Structural inequalities rooted in ownership and power are recast as reflections of character. When a worker struggles, the explanation offered is not exploitation but insufficiency. This moral interpretation redirects anger inward rather than upward. The system remains unquestioned that, while the individual doubts himself, consumer culture reinforces this illusion. The worker's identity becomes tied to purchasing power, consumption is equated with freedom, and brands replace collective belonging. The capacity to buy is treated as evidence of participation in prosperity, even when wages barely sustain basic needs. The appearance of choice among commodities distracts from the absence of choice in production. One may select between products, yet one cannot select the conditions under which those products are made. Media and education institutions play a decisive role in sustaining false consciousness. Economic relation. Are described as natural laws rather than historical constructs. Capital accumulation is framed as innovation, and corporate leaders are portrayed as visionaries. Labor struggles are minimized or depicted as disruptions to harmony. The language of class is diluted, replaced with neutral terms like middle class or job creators. In this narrative, exploitation vanishes beneath technical vocabulary and celebratory imagery. The worker, surrounded by these messages, begins to internalize them. Gratitude replaces grievance. The employer is seen as a provider of opportunity rather than an appropriator of surplus value. The extraction of profit from collective labor is normalized as reward for risk. The worker may even defend policies that weaken labor protections, believing that such measures promote growth and therefore benefit all. Identification with capital becomes stronger than identification with class. False consciousness also thrives on fragmentation. Differences of race, nationality, gender, and culture are emphasized to prevent recognition of shared economic conditions. Workers are encouraged to compete across these lines, blaming one another for scarcity rather than stoning the structure that produces it. The resulting divisions obscure the underlying unity of exploitation. Attention is diverted from ownership to identity, from class to competition. Technological progress is often invoked as evidence that the system works for everyone. Innovations that increase productivity are celebrated as collective achievements, yet their benefits are unevenly distributed. Automation may eliminate jobs, but the narrative focuses on efficiency and growth. The displacement of workers is reframed as the cost of progress. Those who suffer are told to retrain, adapt, or innovate themselves. Structural displacement becomes a personal challenge. Even suffering is commodified as motivation. Struggle is romanticized as a test of character, and endurance is praised as strength. The worker is urged to hustle, to embrace insecurity as a path to greatness. Exploitation becomes a proving ground rather than an injustice. Through this lens, systemic critique appears as weakness or envy, while acceptance of hardship appears as maturity. False consciousness does not require that workers be unaware of their difficulties. It requires that they misinterpret their causes. One may recognize exhaustion, debt, and instability, yet attribute them to personal misfortune or temporary market conditions rather than to structural exploitation. The system survives not because its contradictions are invisible, but because their meaning is distorted. In masking exploitation as opportunity, false consciousness transforms power into aspiration. It persuades the oppressed to seek fulfillment within the very structure that confines them. The promise of advancement obscures the reality of extraction. The worker chases a horizon defined by capital, believing that integration into the system is liberation rather than recognizing that true emancipation demands transformation of the relations of production themselves. That collective organization is not a sentimental ideal, it is a material necessity born from the structure of class society. The worker, standing alone in the marketplace, possesses little power against those who command capital. Individually, each labor is replaceable, vulnerable, compelled by necessity to accept conditions imposed from above. But collectively, workers constitute the living force that animates the entire system of production. It is only when this force recognizes itself as a unified class that the balance of power begins to shift. The foundation of exploitation lies in fragmentation. Capital thrives when workers are isolated, when they perceive their struggles as personal rather than structural. In isolation, fear prevails. One worker fears unemployment, another fears demotion, a third fears exclusion. These fears prevent coordinated resistance. Yet, when workers come together, they discover that their grievances are shared, the insecurity of one is mirrored in the insecurity of many. This recognition transforms private anxiety into public awareness. Collective organization begins with consciousness. Workers must understand that their conditions are not the result of individual failure, but of systemic design. The extraction of surplus value, the suppression of wages, the extension of working hours, these are not accidents but outcomes of a structure that prioritizes profit over human dignity. When this understanding spreads, solidarity emerges not from abstract sympathy but from shared material interest. Unions historically represent the first stage of such organization. Through unions, workers negotiate wages, demand safer conditions, and establish limits on exploitation. These gains demonstrate the power of coordinated action. That a single worker who refuses unfair treatment may be dismissed without consequence. 1,000 workers who refuse together can halt production. The strike, the collective withdrawal of labor, reveals a fundamental truth: capital depends on labor for its existence. Without the cooperation of workers, machinery stands idle and profit evaporates. Yet collective organization must extend beyond economic negotiation. Liberation requires not merely better terms within the system, but transformation of the system itself. Political organization becomes essential. Workers must assert influence over the laws and institutions that shape economic relations. Policies governing ownership, taxation, labor rights, and public resources determine the distribution of power. Without political engagement, economic victories remain fragile, subject to reversal by legislative decree or corporate maneuver. Solidarity must transcend divisions deliberately cultivated by the ruling class. Differences of race, nationality, religion, and gender are manipulated to fragment the working class. These distinctions, though socially significant, do not negate the shared condition of exploitation. That collective organization requires recognition that liberation for one segment of the working class cannot be achieved at the expense of another. Unity strengthens bargaining power and undermines strategies of division. Internationalism further expands this principle. Capital operates across borders. Relocating production to regions where labor is cheapest and regulations weakest. If workers organize only within national boundaries, they remain vulnerable to this mobility. Cross-border solidarity counters the global reach of capital. When workers in different countries coordinate demands and share strategies, they challenge the capacity of corporations to exploit disparities. Collective organization also reshapes consciousness. Participation in democratic assemblies, cooperative decision-making, and shared struggle cultivates confidence and political maturity. Workers who once viewed themselves as powerless individuals begin to see themselves as agents of history. The act of organizing becomes transformative, dissolving the internalized inferiority fostered by systems of domination. Through collective action, workers learn not only to resist but to govern. The ultimate aim of such organization is the reconfiguration of ownership and control over production. If the means by which society sustains itself remain privately owned, dependence and inequality persist. Collective organization lays the groundwork for collective ownership. When workers control the institutions they operate, production can be oriented toward need rather than profit. Democratic planning replaces market anarchy, and social priorities replace shareholder returns. Critics often claim that collective organization threatens efficiency or individual freedom. Yet the current system sacrifices both in pursuit of accumulation. Efficiency measured solely by profit ignores wasted resources and unmet needs. Freedom confined to the marketplace neglects the constraints imposed by economic necessity. Collective organization seeks to align production with human development, expanding rather than constraining genuine liberty. The path to liberation is neither spontaneous nor effortless. It requires sustained effort, education, and discipline. Organization must be deliberate, structured, and resilient against repression. Those who benefit from the status quo will resist transformation. Legal obstacles, media campaigns, and economic retaliation are deployed to discourage unity. The endurance of collective movements depends on shared commitment and clear vision. History demonstrates that significant social advances have emerged from organized struggle. Labor rights, public education, social welfare programs, and democratic reforms were not gifts from benevolent lights, but achievements wrested through coordinated action. Each victory affirms that collective power can overcome entrenched interests. Liberation cannot be achieved through isolated success stories or individual escape from exploitation. As long as the structure remains intact, that personal advancement leaves systemic inequality untouched. True emancipation demands collective reorganization of society's economic foundations. That only when workers unite across industries and communities, recognizing their common stake in transformation, does the possibility of a just and equitable order become tangible. That collective organization channels dispersed frustration into coherent force. That converting shared labor into shared power and forging the instrument through which the working class can dismantle exploitation and assert control over its collective destiny. Comrades, the veil has been lifted. We have seen how the system engineers dependence to manufacture loyalty, how private ownership create official scarcity to preserve control, how fear and insecurity discipline obedience, how false consciousness disguises exploitation as opportunity, and how only collective organization can transform power from the hands of the few to the strength of the many. These are not isolated injustices. They are interconnected mechanisms of a single structure designed to extract wealth while securing consent. The ruling class maintains dominance not merely through wealth, but through shaping perception. It teaches the worker to fear instability more than injustice, to pursue individual advancement rather than collective liberation, to defend the very institutions that confine him. But once the worker recognizes these mechanisms, the illusion begins to fracture. Consciousness becomes resistance. Awareness becomes power. The truth is simple and revolutionary. The system survives because labor sustains it. Every factory, every office, every industry depends upon the coordinated effort of workers. Capital does not create value. It accumulates the value created by human hands and minds. The strength of society lies not in boardrooms or stock exchanges, but in the collective capacity of those who produce. When workers stand divided, they are manageable. When they stand united, they are unstoppable. The future is not predetermined by markets or dictated by capital. It is shaped by struggle. History moves when ordinary people recognize their shared condition and act together to change it. The emancipation of the working class will not be granted from above. It must be built from below, through solidarity, organization, and unwavering resolve. Let us reject loyalty to systems that exploit us. Let us reject fear as the measure of our decisions. Let us reject the illusion that opportunity exists within structures designed to confine us. Instead, let us embrace unity, clarity, and action. The world that labor built can be reclaimed by labor. Comrades, the time is not for quiet endurance, but for conscious transformation. Organize in your workplaces. Educate in your communities. Unite across divisions. Withdraw your consent from exploitation and give it instead to solidarity. The chains that bind the many can be broken only by the many. You are not powerless. You are not dependent by nature. You are the producers of all wealth, the architects of all progress, the foundation of society itself. Rise together, and the system that once commanded your loyalty will discover that its power was always borrowed from you.